Hello, and welcome to The Dark Dive, the podcast that delves into the depths of the dark web and cybersecurity. My name is Aidan Murphy, and I'm your host. And in this month's episode, we're returning to the topic of attack surface management, also known as ASM. In particular, how it relates to a relatively new cybersecurity term. Hold tight for another acronym, CTEM, Continuous Threat Exposure Management. CTEM, which we're going to define, has quickly gained traction, not least because of the emphasis placed on it by the analyst firm Gartner. But in many ways, it can be seen as an evolution of attack surface management. Joining me to discuss exactly what CTEM is, its relevance to the cybersecurity industry, and its relationship to attack surface management are Ben Jones, CEO and co-founder of Searchlight Cyber. Welcome back, Ben.
Hi there, thank you.
And Michael Gianarakis, Senior Vice President of Attack Surface Management at Searchlight Cyber. Welcome back, Michael.
Thanks, Aidan.
Michael and Ben were both on our previous Attack Surface Management 101 episode, but I will just ask you to reintroduce yourselves to listeners. Can we start with you, Ben?
Hi, I'm Ben Jones. I'm the co-founder of Searchlight Cyber and the CEO. We established the company in 2017 and have been working to help protect companies and society as a whole since then.
Brilliant, thanks, Ben. And Michael?
Yeah, I'm Michael Gianarakis. I'm the SVP of Attack Surface Management, as you mentioned earlier. I came into Searchlight through the AssetNote acquisition. I was one of the co-founders and the CEO of AssetNote. And at AssetNote, we pioneered the attack surface management space.
Brilliant, thanks, Michael. Before we start, I just want to say that this episode ties in with the new ebook we've released, ASM in the Age of CTEM, which you can download for free from the link in the show notes. You don't have to have read the book to enjoy this episode. We're going to start from the beginning here, but it's certainly a good place to follow up after the episode if you'd like to know more. So, Michael, I'm going to begin with you, and let's start with CTEM. Can you explain to listeners where this new term has come from?
I mean, it's primarily come from Gartner, the analyst firm. They're pitching it as essentially a modern practice for managing exposure in your organization. I have some very strong opinions on this, just given the history. One of the challenges that I have is that when we came up with the term ASM at AssetNote and we started building our product, what Gartner really describes as CTEM, in my opinion, is what ASM should have always been. And it really is a more modern way to think about managing, the exposure inside your attack surface and inside your organization more generally. And I think ultimately, and I've said this on previous podcasts, that security doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? It is a reflection of the larger trends in the business and IT in general. And I think CTEM, ASM, whatever you want to call it, I think ultimately really what it's about is taking that into account and trying to come up with a systematized framework or a practice with which to manage those sort of modern challenges, right? Highly dynamic attack surfaces, new and emerging threats, strained resourcing. And I think that's really the heart of it. I'll save my stronger opinions about the analyst firms pushing this idea and perhaps there's some other elements at play, but I think, the heart of it is good. And really, that's sort of my summary of what it's about.
That was really helpful, Michael. So yeah, it's a funny thing, isn't it? And I think a lot of people listening to this will know the feeling of a new term springing up. Sometimes we talk about cybersecurity jargon. Maybe that's slightly unfair when it comes to CTEM, but effectively describing something that may have organically appeared anyway. And like you say, from your perspective, CTEM almost describes what you were calling attack surface management this whole time. Ben, how do you feel about Michael's strong opinion there? From your perspective, is CTEM offering something new, or is it just a kind of another buzzword that we need to all settle with?
I think it is a good way of structuring the way in which you think about these things. I don't think it's revolutionary in the way that it totally changes the way which everybody thinks about things. I think it is a way of trying to organize some of these thoughts, and the fact that it's continuous and the fact that it's looking at it from an outside in, with particularly from the attack surface management side, I think that is a useful evolution of security rather than just looking at your feet the whole time.
I think another way to look at it is to contrast it with, what came before and how it was common to manage this sort of stuff before. And that's why I say it's more of a modern interpretation of how customers or organizations rather can manage their exposure in their environment. if you looked previously, most processes were point in time, right? Vulnerability management, as an example. You'd run a scan or you'd do a pen test, and that's it until the next time you scheduled one or you did one. It was often very disjointed in terms of processes. You'd have, threat intelligence over in one area, and you'd have, say vulnerability management is another example over another area, and they wouldn't really inform each other. Very point in time, very static. And I think the ideas, at least the core ideas behind CTEM, is one, to really understand what it is that's important to you, understand what you're trying to protect, and then look at that and monitor that on a continuous basis and in a threat-informed manner, and with a heavy focus on how to operationalize those issues, and doing that in a more continuous and ongoing manner rather than, static point in time, very reactive. The idea is to try and shift this to be a more proactive practice.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess the sense I'm getting from both of you is that this is a useful framework that encompasses a lot of where the security industry was going anyway. And from both of your companies and previous companies' point of view, something we were both kind of coming at from the same direction. And the new emphasis, I guess, is on this continuous and more kind of holistic approach. Michael, I guess there might be people listening to this who have never come across CTEM before. Maybe that's why they're listening in the first place. It might be helpful, before we go a little bit more depth into what makes up CTEM, what's your sense of how it's being used today? Like, how well defined do you think it is? How widely adopted? Do you get the sense that everybody in the industry is talking about CTEM, or are we still very early in that Gartner hype cycle, to use that phrase?
Yeah, I think we are definitely very early stages, and perhaps it's the vendors that talk about CTEM a little bit more than the customers at this stage. However, I do see that growing, right? Because ultimately this is the way, whether they have a name for it, whether they came to it through Gartner, through their own evolution, or through working with products like ours, right? This is the trend in terms of how people are shifting their perspective on how they manage exposure. And, it is very much a practice, right? So this is something that Gartner has pushed very heavily. Now, partially that's so to try and avoid a whole bunch of vendors saying, hey, we're a CTEM vendor, because they want to make it clear that it's a practice. I think they also want to use it as a bit of a meta category for their analysis. But, putting all that kind of analyst cynicism aside, it is the right way to think about it, right? You shouldn't be thinking about these sorts of things purely in the perspective of tools. This is very much about how you manage your exposure. It is a framework for you to build around and adapt to your needs. It's not overly prescriptive. Generally, it's a bit more of a guide around the key areas that you should be thinking about and the key processes that you should be putting in place. And so I think, in some respects, there are many organizations that are coming to this on their own, regardless of whatever they call it. Because as I said earlier, it's a reaction to a need that they have, right? Point in time, siloed systems, and processes that are ultimately very reactive and not without a heavy focus on remediation, operationalizing the issues and the findings. People who are doing it that way are struggling with managing this in their environments, and so they are looking for a new way, a way that's going to be able to adapt to the current trends and the current needs that they have. And so I think many people are coming to it, and have over the last few years, are coming to it on their own, regardless of whether that's come from, Gartner sort of formalizing it and putting it out there, or they're kind of just figuring out that we need a better way. And so I think it's getting there. And I don't think it's purely in reaction to Gartner.
Yeah, it's an organic thing. And then, like we've been discussing, I guess, and Gartner's put the term to it, and that's helpful, and it makes it clearer for everybody. As Gartner defines it, there are 5 stages of CTEM. They are scoping, discovery, prioritization, validation, and mobilization. Michael, maybe you can do the honors for us. Can you walk us through what each of these stages means in practice?
Yeah, I'll go through each of the stages, but one thing to remember with CTEM is that this is continuous. One stage feeds into the other and vice versa in a constant continuous cycle. So it's not necessarily a waterfall, it is a process or a practice, as I mentioned earlier. So starting with scoping, scoping is really about, fundamentally understanding what's important to you and what's important to your organization. So it's really understanding the scope of the CTEM practice and what it should cover as a baseline for informing, the next stages in the process. Discovery then is, once you understand what's important to you, is understanding what you have there in those areas to protect, right? So this is looking at whether it's asset discovery, whether it's, discovery from a more database perspective, and understanding the information that you have that you're trying to protect. It is really across the board to get your head around, what you have to protect essentially. Then moving on is prioritization. So this is recognizing, ultimately resource constraints and, other sorts of constraints that might exist, to your organization. So once you've sort of figured out, okay, well, what's the scope of this? What's important to us? What do we have to protect? The next stage is to then take another lens to that in terms of understanding, how am I going to approach that? What's the most important areas to focus on? And what are the more important parts of this process than others? And again, this will vary depending on your organization, your threat environment, as well as your resources and capabilities as well. And then ultimately validation, that's sort of the next step. So this is where you are identifying exposures and validating them. So priority and prioritization and validation kind of bleed into each other. And you'll often have, these are the areas where exposures are coming up, right? And you're taking those exposures, you're running it through the lens of your prioritization, you're validating these to then feed into the final step, which is mobilization, which is essentially, what are you going to do to remediate these issues? And how do you know that they're remediated? And then the whole cycle kind of starts over again. Although, realistically, the scoping part doesn't necessarily always happen continuously. Technically it should, right? But usually it kind of flows back into discovery. And that's sort of where it happens, tends to be in practice, where the cycle continues. But technically you should be thinking about your scoping element on an ongoing basis as well.
Thanks, Michael. I think it's a really, really great overview. And Ben, I'm going to call on you next, because I think when Michael spells it out, it makes a ton of sense. But maybe just to be completely explicit about it, how does kind of thinking about your security in these 5 stages and kind of running through those 5 stages as part of CTEM, how does it help security teams? How is it kind of a change for what they might have been doing before? How does it reflect their kind of modern security needs?
I think it is a reflection where you have this continuous element that your attack surface is constantly changing, where you're running things in cloud environments, where you're spinning up new servers, maybe new services and websites and updates, that the sooner you can discover if there is a particular issue, the safer you are, because you'll have people who are continuously scanning your site from the outside. So that continuous part is really important. I think in terms of organizing these and thinking of it from a constraint point of view as well, and what can be automated and what has to be done manually, because this is ultimately what's going to restrict you as a security team, is how much you can get done. And so the scoping will obviously have to be realistic, but you need to make sure that you cover everything that's going to potentially be a vulnerability. Otherwise, there's no point of you doing any of this really, if you just leave yourself with a gaping hole in your security. And the discovery element will come down to the practice and discipline as an organization. But realistically, you will have people spinning up new infrastructure, new services coming out within the products, and maybe an attack surface, which is far more amorphous now than it ever has been before. And so having that continuous discovery element in there is very useful. And that's something which you can automate and push out as part of a tool set which you're using out there. And then when it comes down to the prioritization and validation, this is more around, with the resource constraint, what do you look at first, and how do you ultimately cope with all of the alerts that you'll be getting? And so you want to have a purest signal as you can and as little noise in there as possible. So once again, you want to try and automate where you can to get the noise out of the signal. But prioritization and validation, to me, feel very much around, well, the prioritization is which ones do we go on first, and which is very much resource constraint. Ideally, you would do everything all at once, but that's not going to be feasible. There's going to be far too much coming at you to be able to do that. And so you need to have some sort of context behind you to help you prioritize those things. And I think that's where we start talking about some of the threat intelligence that can feed into that as well. But ultimately, the validation will help give you a really pure signal in terms of what you're looking at. So there's no point wasting time on threats which actually aren't real. And that is a major concern of people who are working on security at the moment is all of the alerts that you can be getting and the false positives associated with it. So the better you can validate these exploits, the more you can automate that process, the more your team is going to be able to do to protect your infrastructure as a whole, rather than dealing with these false positives. And equally, again, when it comes down to the remediation, some of those things can be automated, but some of those things are going to have to be manual. Thinking it through that lens of resource constraint, and then what you can automate will save a lot of time for your team. And so when you implement that in real life, these are all of the things that you're going to have to consider as you get through that.
Yeah, no, these are really good points, and this is something that we talk about internally a lot. You picked up on signal. One of the core beliefs that we have is that low signal is endemic in security tooling, and it ultimately reduces your security posture. There's a bunch of stuff out there, and there's a little bit of this inside CTEM, some sort of acknowledgement. To me personally, I don't think prioritization and validation should exist as that separate, right? If we take sort of identifying vulnerabilities, right? This is a core thing that our platform does. You look at the common approach among security tooling, and honestly, it's the lazy approach where they'll just sort of try and match assets based on their characteristics up to a CV database and say, here's a list of issues. It spits out far too many alerts and far too many false positive alerts, while also allowing a lot of false negatives to exist. And so, then you'll have all these vendors come together and say, well, actually what we're going to do to help you prioritize is we'll put in, these various other metrics. So it starts with CVSS, right? There was a study not too long ago where they looked at the common practice, which is sort of basic heuristics around, we just prioritize everything that's a CVSS X or above. And there was some research done that showed that was no more effective than if they just picked the vulnerabilities at random to address and to fix. And so then they go and they evolve and they say, oh, well, we've got this new system called exploit, the exploit prediction system. So the EPSS system, which is designed to sort of give you another layer of prioritization around, well, this one's potentially more important because it's more likely to be exploitable. But none of them think of the basic idea of, why don't you just see if it's exploitable when you identify it, and only raise it if it is actually exploitable, which is the approach that we take. And really, it feels like a lot of these solutions are simply solving problems that these vendors have created themselves. I think there is a better way with a lot of this sort of stuff. And again, bringing it back to sort of this concept of, this is a practice. It's not about tools, but you should be looking at how your tools can impact the effectiveness of this process. Another thing that we talk about in the continuous element of this and the idea of being more proactive is a concept we call tool lag, which is simply based on the tools that you select, your ability to identify and remediate these and minimize your mean time of exposure is ultimately impacted simply because of the quality and the choice of tools that you have. While it isn't the focus of CTEM, it does play an important role. And I think the other thing, which maybe we will touch on, because we've kind of spoken a little bit about the threat intelligence, a little bit about the ASM products, and how they fit in. Another thing that I would think of is also separating the idea of the practice and the idea of the tools. Gartner themselves, but also a lot of vendors will come and they'll be on one of two extremes, which is to say that we're a CTEM platform and we do everything, right? One-stop shop. Whether you can trust that or not, whether that's effective across all of it or not, or flexible enough for your practice is another question, right? The other way of looking at it, and Gartner is guilty of this, is sort of saying, okay, well, these categories of tools will fit into each of these 5 stages of CTEM. For scoping, discovery, prioritization, validation, etc. But really, I think, again, thinking of this as a practice, it shouldn't necessarily be so clean cut. There are elements of the threat intelligence side of things, for example, that fit into all 5 stages. Similarly with ASM, that also fit into all 5 stages, as well as other tools and practices. So I think it's important to consider those two concepts separately, but also how they slot in together.
Yeah, well, you've brilliantly led me on to what my next question was, which is it did occur to me while you were speaking, Michael, and I know that you have this opinion that those 5 stages we've described, a lot of those are covered within what we would consider to be ASM. So I guess maybe let's just start there and be explicit about it. What role does ASM have to play within this CTEM process, this framework? Can it be used at each stage, and is there a role for it at each stage?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question because there's ASM as we define it and how we've built our product, which is actually closer to CTEM. So it is built around, one, the idea that this is a holistic continuous practice, and two, with a heavy focus on particularly the mobilization stage, right, the remediation phase, as well as as we've just discussed, very opinionated perspectives on things like prioritization and validation. ASM in the broader market context, for better or for worse, didn't evolve down that path. The majority of the market looks at ASM as simply as asset discovery. I do think the market is shifting and is catching up, and I think things like the CTEM framework have spurred that a little bit. But in terms of what we do with ASM, with the Astronaut product, is we fit into all of those stages in some form or fashion, right? Obviously, there's going to be a heavy predominance on some more than others. For example, I think scoping and discovery are kind of linked, and so the discovery side, in terms of mapping out what you have to protect, is definitely a key part of the platform, and not only discovering the breadth of the attack surface, but also going to a certain level of depth as well. What's running on those assets, what are the applications, what kind of data is being shown, are there any APIs, the full extent of the attack surface. But scoping, as we discussed earlier, I think is really more of an organizational question rather than anything that's sort of tool led or tool supported. It's like, what is important for you to focus on ultimately, and that's an organizational question. But certainly discovery, definitely, and then that bleeds into prioritization as well, in terms of understanding some of the characteristics across the attack surface that might cause more exposure, that might be more challenging to deal with, whether it's your cloud attack surface, which is generally pretty dynamic, your third-party attack surface, which we've spoken about previously, in terms of that being a real blind spot for a lot of organizations in terms of the exposure in their attack surface. And then from there, there's the identification piece, and identifying these exposures, which really fits in the prioritization validation phase. Now, we kind of combine those two to a certain extent. The way that we approach identifying exposures is very high signal. So we will, for example, for vulnerabilities, but for all our different exposure types, we will only raise it if there is real impact already that we can demonstrate. So for a vulnerability, we don't raise it unless we determine that it's actually exploitable in your attack surface. In the context of all your mitigations, all your controls, all of the preconditions necessary, whatever the case may be, we determine that it's exploitable, and then we raise it. And so, so that kind of cuts down on some of the headache and the burden in implementing a process like this, because you're not then having to take a large list of mostly garbage issues and then taking it through a prioritization layer first to kind of cut that down to something more manageable, and then going through another layer of validation to weed out all the false positives and the issues before you can even start looking at fixing this. We try and cut that cycle short through more intelligent and ultimately, and I'm biased here, a better approach there. And then the other key element of our platform in particular is, and we've spoken about this previously on other podcasts, but one of the core ideas that we have at Astronaut, why we built our ASM in this way and our product in this way, is we firmly believe that a list of assets is not the end in of itself. It's what you want to do with it. And so the whole product has been designed with a heavy focus on how can you take these and embed that into your existing processes, or create processes around this information to effectively operationalize this information and the remediation of these. Because if it's not muscle memory, if it's not baked in, if it's not process driven and it's reactive all the time, then you're always playing catch up. And that's really, I think, what the draw of CTEM is for a lot of organizations, is that they hate that and they want to get ahead of this stuff. And so there's also, I've just spoken about the ASM side. There's also a number of ways in which the intelligence piece comes into it, but I'm sure Ben's raring to go on that one.
Yeah, you preempted me again, Michael. Yeah, so Ben, you have mentioned threat intelligence already, but where does it fall within the CTEM area? Is it mostly around this prioritization? So like you were talking about establishing threats based on what you see out there in the wild as well, or is there more of a role for threat intelligence to play here?
I think that the threat intelligence can go into discovery through to the rest of it. I mean, the mobilization is obviously depending on what you do with the data, but with the prioritization and the validation, it can feed into that. I think that's maybe, Michael, where we can sort of go back and forth on this a little bit as well, is in terms of how maybe some other companies deal with this prioritization element of it, and then how we deal with it and how that can vary, and how threat intelligence can also feed into that as well. Because my understanding of some of what other companies do is more based around heuristics and looking at maybe some level of context, but it's effectively correlation and with some sort of level of filtration over the top of it. And so they'll be looking at, okay, we have this particular vulnerability. We know in the wild, X number of companies are exposed to this, so it's going to be like a high level of exposure. The potential outcome of it is going to be pretty high, so we'll push it up that way. And maybe they've seen some evidence of it being used out in the wild in some way as well. And then therefore they'll then push this up as being something important for you to then go in and address. But I guess ultimately it is a bit of a sticky plaster for trying to work out whether it is a genuine threat to you or not. And it feels to me the best way of finding out whether it's a genuine threat or not is to just go and test it and see if it is a real threat, or whether it's something you're actually protected against, where it doesn't really cause you a problem. So I think from the audience's point of view, it'll be interesting to find out like the specifics of how you guys do that in terms of the ASM product. And then we can talk about some of the other areas and how threat intelligence can feed into that. But I think other companies do, in terms of that prioritization element, do rely a lot more on threat intelligence than we do. I think it still has a place to play within that whole area. And I think even with those which are proven to be genuine vulnerabilities in your system, you're still going to have some way of ranking those and also getting some additional context behind that as well. But maybe if you can just talk us quickly through about how you guys actually validate this stuff within the platform.
Yeah, and in terms of validating this and how we're bringing the intelligence piece that we have, particularly the market leading sort of dark web intelligence piece that we have into this process is, like you said, the core of how it's kind of done today is essentially filtering, right? It's filtering out a large bit of information and trying to, base on very basic characteristics, filter that down to a list of possible things that you might care about. I think one of the challenges with intelligence in general is that it's not very actionable, generally speaking. It's not able to be applied. It's not really applied intelligence. And I think that's sort of where we come at it, as Searchlight, very differently. And, one of the things that, we look at when it comes to this sort of intelligence is it does map to all the stages, just as our approach with attack surface management and exposure management does in general. I would actually go one step further, Ben. You said it doesn't really apply to scoping. I think it can absolutely also apply to scoping in terms of understanding the broader threat landscape and having a deeper understanding of the broader threat landscape. But as it comes into discovery, prioritization, I mean, there's simplistic ways, which is that sort of filtering mechanism where it's like, okay, we're seeing generalized activity related to these vulnerabilities in terms of threat actors. So if you're seeing them, if Asset Note is highlighting them as exploitable issues that exist today on your attack surface, that certainly leads to a potentially higher level of priority. But looking to take that one step further and being able to utilize the deep understanding that we have of the attack surface, not just your list of assets, but a real deep understanding of what's running on those assets, the traffic to and from those assets, and then taking that to provide an even more, I guess, personalized perspective on the threat landscape is another one. But I think the one that I'm most excited about is thinking about it coming out into that mobilization piece. I was talking to a customer the other day, and we were going through zero-day vulnerabilities that we had discovered on their attack surface. We were talking about it. We were talking about how to fix it. And as soon as they were done, right off the bat, they then turned around and said, okay, let's look at, our dark web products and see if there's any breaches or any issues related to this particular exposure. So it's not just about the front end of it, but the back end of that. And what really struck me about that is, using all our product suite together, but it was very much just kind of candid, just the way that they would do things. It's just the process. It's not, oh, hey, here's an issue or here's an incident, and then we need to respond to it. It's the day-to-day course of managing the whole life cycle of the exposure. It's not just then fixing it and addressing, the immediate hole that we were finding in the platform, but then it's going that next step and being holistic about it, and then just doing that as an everyday thing. And I think, that's really the ultimate vision of how we can bring these two elements together and how that can fit into all the stages of CTEM.
Yeah, I like the way that threat intelligence can extend in terms of that discovery as well, because the attack surface management, you have your attack surface, which is your infrastructure and everything around you, but there is an extended attack surface beyond that, which is out of your control, really. So this is other data that's going out there. If you think of your employees and your customers and your supply chain and other information that goes out there as also part of your attack surface, these are all things that could potentially be used against you in order to get into your security. So finding out things around your employees, if any of their systems have been breached, which then can potentially get access into your system, stuff that's being published out there on maybe Git repositories or in other file sharing sites or in open buckets or anything like that, that could also cause you a security risk. So feeding into that with the threat intelligence in terms of the discovery, I think is powerful, and just looking at your entire extended attack surface there. Obviously, the vulnerabilities that lie on your system will be one of the ways in which they get into your system directly, but there are indirect ways in which you could potentially become vulnerable as well. So providing the context and the background, not just in that discovery, but then also, okay, well, how much of a threat are those things? And then to find some way of testing them as well is also really powerful and adds to that.
Absolutely. And I think, this is one of the key things where we think a little bit differently to everybody else, right? When we think about attack surface management products, as we've sort of spoken about earlier in terms of the market being just focused on basic asset discovery, because we think about this as a practice and we think about this holistically, it does encompass all these other areas, right? That is your attack surface. Your employees are an attack surface. All of the data that you have, whether that's on assets and systems you control, or whether that's in the hands of third parties or various other SaaS platforms, like you mentioned, GitHub as an example, that's all part of your attack surface. And these all have their own unique considerations in terms of how you monitor for exposure and how you then manage and remediate it. So yeah, there is that sort of concept of the extended attack surface. I think the only reason we need to call it out on a podcast like this is because a lot of other approaches in this space do demarcate that very heavily, whereas we think about it holistically as all of that, as part of your attack surface, and all of that needs to come in under a unified way of managing it, right? Again, going to the point of, to me, that's just attack surface management, but it's also CTEM. I use those terms interchangeably, but that is the idea of it, right? Is taking a broader approach to this rather than being siloed and limited in each of these areas.
Another way I want to look at this, and maybe, Michael, this might come to be some of your more controversial opinions, because we've spoken a lot now about the benefits of the CTEM approach, but are there any pitfalls? I'm not going to say negatives, but any pitfalls, any traps you can see maybe organizations falling into if they don't come about this the right way, or anything they should be aware of if they're just starting on this journey?
Yeah. I think the biggest one ultimately is something that we've already discussed, which is that, looking at this purely as it's a tools-based approach, right? Where, they'll look at, a big platform and say, hey, this will tick the box, right? And, that may be true. I mean, we've spoken about how at Searchlight, we cover all of these areas in various ways, and our products do support all of the stages of CTEM. However, I think for an organization looking to implement this and get the most out of it, they still need to come at it from the base of looking at this as, this is how we are going to do this going forward. This is how we are going to manage exposure in our environment for our organization in general, and treating it like the practice that it is, and that the tools and the platforms are just there to support that practice. So starting from that sort of process first perspective, I think is the right way to go. That should also inform, the tools and the platforms. As a core design principle, we build the tools to be very flexible, very extensible, heavily integrated into other tools and other processes. And it's for that reason, right? It's so that you can then take this and embed that in various ways, that work for you in terms of implementing a system like that. So I think that's sort of the first pitfall. The other one is, we also touched on it earlier, just around the concept of picking the tools in this space and the issues that come with the base approach to that, right? And where that might be in contrast to your goals from a process and practice perspective, which is why it's important for it to come first, right? So you're not bound necessarily by the limitations of the tools in terms of how you implement your practice, because that's the approach you've taken. If you take it as a practice first and a process first perspective, then you can kind of craft that to actually support that process. And so some of the pitfalls that we see are just things like following blindly the sort of output and the way that tools work and say, this is me doing this, right? So for example, the prioritization and validation piece, and not really thinking about that in terms of what you're trying to achieve, but just being exacerbated or being led down, I suppose, is a better way to put it, by the limitations of the tool. So prioritization, I spoke about the really rudimentary ways in which companies will approach prioritization, really basic heuristic approaches that are based on simplistic, heuristics. So CVSS scores, even EPSS scores, they're not really giving you much, right, in terms of supporting this process. So look at different ways that, whether it's through a tool, but again, come at it from how do you want to approach this and what are you looking for? But look at different ways that you can optimize this process, without being held back by the existing sort of tooling. And I think those are probably the biggest ones. And then ultimately, finally, I would say, I know we've been talking about CTEM and its value, and I do think it has value, but again, go back to what's important to you. Don't just do something because it's what Gartner are saying, right? The reality is that most of the Gartner analysts do not have any practical security experience. At the end of the day, you're the ones that are on the ground dealing with this. You're the ones that are dealing with the risk. It's your job to manage this exposure. So do what works for you. Whatever you call it doesn't matter. But again, coming back to the core principles of it needs to be something that is continuous, because, attack surfaces these days are very dynamic and constantly evolving. It needs to be threat informed. So it needs to be realistic for your organization and matter to your organization. And it needs to be outcome focused, right? And focused on being proactive and addressing these issues as quickly as possible as a matter of day-to-day process. And that's really the idea, whether we call it CTEM, whether we call it ASM, whatever you guys want to call it, right? You might have your own, name internally for the way that you do things. That's really the idea. And so start from those principles and then work from there. And I think you'll be okay.
I think it's a really important point. I think a lot of what you've touched on there comes under that, doesn't it? Which is, like you say, this is a way that it's been defined by Gartner. These are quite, like you said, it's kind of good in its flexibility, but that also leaves a lot of scope for different interpretations. So yeah, like you say, mobilization or prioritization or discovery, these mean different things to different people. And it's that thing of like, practically, it's not a tick box exercise of we've done prioritization. It's thinking about, what does that mean for my organization? How does it work best for me? What tools do I need? Rather than just saying we've ticked the Gartner box, basically.
Absolutely. One of the sayings that we have internally on the product team that we really like is progress, not perfection. And I think that just applies to security as well. You should always be looking to optimize and improve your process and your practice of exposure management. And really, that's the goal. So I wouldn't stress too much about, are we implementing something like this perfectly? I wouldn't think about it as a framework or a standard in the sense of I'm at a certain level and I need to get to another level and I need to tick all these boxes. I mean, if that's the takeaway, I personally feel like you're not looking at it the right way. I guess what I'm trying to say is like, give yourself a bit of grace here, right? Like managing exposure in an attack surface is hard and it is complicated. And, organizations for the most part are certainly resource constrained. I never met a CISO who wasn't, begging for more resources, right? So, take this as an iterative process, think about these principles and then build from there. Right. And build as you go and bed down the stuff that's most important to you. Start with that scoping piece and then build from there. And I think, then you'll start to be heading in the right direction in terms of how to get the most out of this more modern approach.
Brilliant. And Ben, from your perspective, are there any pitfalls people should be thinking about, red flags or warning signs if people are starting on the CTEM process?
Well, more widely with some of this security stuff that I've seen in the past is where companies start off with their own tool set, they build it out, and then they then have to manage those things. And it is actually very difficult. And I can understand the temptation of wanting to do that from a cost-effective point of view, but also just from a transparency point of view in terms of what you're doing with the tools and building things out which are customized for you. The difficulty that you have is that just maintaining those code bases and those tool sets become a distraction for the team as a whole. And where you are resource constrained is to be able to buy the best and breed tools and then use your resource to then go away and apply those in the best way possible. And so I think it may seem more expensive initially to go out and buy these different tool sets, but I think it actually saves you a lot of time where it really matters in terms of the resource and the bandwidth that you have internally. So using those tool sets, making sure that you have the best information available. So once again, some of these things can just be tick box exercises where I say, okay, well, I'll get some threat intelligence. So I'll just buy in some cheap dark web fee from somewhere else, and then I'll just apply that. And I'll say, okay, well, I've got that one covered. I have the threat intel element covered. Or you go and sort of deploy something around which is based on Showdown, or some other tool set where it's not scanning constantly. And so you end up with those sort of like snapshot in time, but it seems continuous because you're constantly asking the same data, the same question over and over again, which feels continuous, but actually it's not continuous because the data that you're asking the questions of is pretty old. And so I think making sure that you spend your resource in the best way possible in terms of actually protecting yourselves using the best tool set, I think sets you up well as a business. Building out and maintaining your own tools is quite a complex thing to do. And if you have the resource to be able to do that as well as the security stuff on top, then sure, go ahead and do it. But if you actually have a limited number of security professionals that can help protect your organization, I would go out and get those best of breed tools, which will give them the best start in terms of being able to protect you. Because as we see constantly, and some recently in the UK and elsewhere, these cyber attacks are crippling for companies. And so you just need to make sure that you can do the best job possible. And as Michael said, you can't get perfection within this because it's a constantly moving target. You just have to do your best and you have to be ahead of the attackers, which is why viewing it from an attacker's point of view is really important.
That leads me really nicely onto something I did want to just ask Michael about before we wrap up, which is about, I guess, measuring success. Again, looking at the ebook, which I will remind people we have for free in the show notes. Please download it. One thing that occurred to me is, I guess, that we've been discussing how CTEM solves a lot of modern security problems, or at least is an approach people can take. So the fluidity of modern infrastructure, time constraints within your team, alert overload, specificity of intelligence to your organization. But one thing that I think stood out to me was that it also provides a way that you could measure success and you could measure benefits to your business without just pointing to the negative space and saying, we stopped an attack that never happened, which sometimes is quite difficult for security people to explain to the board, the benefit of money not spent to a ransomware group or rebuilding infrastructure. So, Michael, how would you suggest that people go about measuring the success of their CTEM process if this is the approach they choose to adopt?
Yeah, no, it is tricky, and this is a very different discussion in terms of, how to prove your value generally, and how do you prove the value of an attack that never happened. The reason the attack didn't happen is because, you are implementing this practice day to day and you are doing it effectively. And that's the reason. And I think, I'll park how you can convince other people that there's value in that.
Maybe a conversation for a different podcast episode.
Yeah, certainly. But I think for this, I'll focus on the security team, and most security teams do understand where they're at and how to do this better. And it really is around, how can we be more optimized and effective in this ongoing process. And in the book, we've got some stages around different sort of levels of capability of what that looks like. So you can get a sense of what's a more mature, I guess, implementation of this process. As I said, though, it's not rigid. It's not like a tick box kind of exercise. This is more of a guide to help you sort of understand not only sort of what you're doing right now, but also what you could maybe implement next, and what could maybe be the next step on that journey to be more optimized. And so, if you want, I'm happy to walk through those.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So starting on sort of the low end in terms of capabilities, right, is what we've called sort of the generic feeds capability, which is simply basic IOCs consuming, threat reports and just the volume of that information. It's certainly better than not, right? But it's not very optimized, right? It's just raw information. Typically, it's not very practically applied. And so that's sort of the starting point. And then, so the next step is asset-centric intel. So it's taking that intelligence and it's taking those IOCs, the threat reports, and then trying to apply it to what you have, right? And what you're trying to protect. So that's the next layer above. It's taking in your attack surface, understanding what it is, and then, doing a basic application of that to your attack surface. Moving up is really around, okay, now that we've got that, how do we get better at understanding what's actually a problem in the attack surface, and what the actual exposures are. And that's where we start to look at exploit validation in an automated perspective, right? So this is, rather than using those basic heuristics like we mentioned earlier, right, actually having your process and how you implement that process be based on identifying real exploitable exposures that can be exploited by attackers, and that are on assets that are being focused on by attackers. So it all builds on each other. That's sort of the next stage, right? So you can really then cut down the noise and start to become a lot more proactive. The next sort of phase above that is what we call research-driven detection. So this is then, taking a more mature look at the intelligence, the attack surface insight that you have, as well as the approach now to identifying exposures, and acting in more of a proactive manner based on research-driven approaches, whether that's through the product and like the nature of the product that you're buying or the service that you're buying. But again, taking it out of a product-centric perspective, that might be a level of customization, that might be a level of personalization to your organization with your process that's based on this research. And then the next evolution, right, goes to the saying that I mentioned earlier, which is feedback informed improvement. So this is sort of like that progress, not perfection perspective. It's like it's constantly improving. So then you take what you've got so far in your process so far, and then every kind of issue that comes up, everything that's resolved is then fed back continuously to improve the process and improve the tooling to make it more intelligent and more effective over time through its application. And then finally, the final stage is fully adaptive, intelligence-oriented CTEM solution. So this is where everything, for the most part, is as automated as possible. Automatic prioritization, automatic validation, having complete visibility, a system and a process that is constantly adapting based on what's going on. And so that's obviously the most mature element or most mature level that you have, right, where the process is working so well, it's improving constantly, that it's just kind of keeping up as a natural part of the process. It's not something that you're having to force and adopt and change. The natural process feeds into itself so that it's constantly improving. And so that's kind of the ultimate sort of goal, I suppose, that you should be working towards. But again, no matter where you sit on this spectrum, right, it's just a bit of a guide. Find where the gaps are for you and find where you're going to get the most value, and take it one step at a time, right? It's a journey, it's not a destination. So think about what the next step is, think about where your pain points are and what can be optimized in this process, and go with that, and then move on to the next one. The key here is, again, and we've stressed this point throughout the whole podcast, which is it's a practice, not a tool, right? So again, the practice is what's important. So find areas in that practice that aren't working so well, aren't driving the outcomes that you want, and then address those. You don't have to, bite off everything, just iterate. And that's sort of the idea. And that really comes back to that continuous part. That's why it's an iterative kind of thing, is because you should be doing this continuously. Don't think about it, I have to be perfect from the get-go. Just build on it. As more capability or more resources open up, expand, constantly look at the outcomes and the output that you're getting, and look at ways in which you can address issues, and then you'll get there, right? You'll get to something that works for you naturally if you take that approach and you think about it as, this is the process I'm taking to manage exposure. This is the practice of exposure management, not just the classic sort of silver bullet thinking. I'm going to buy an all-in-one platform from a gigantic vendor that's going to do everything, right? It never works that way, because it's never effective, and it's not driven by what your needs are. It's driven by the tool, and it should be the other way around.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Michael, for talking that through, and hopefully that gives the listener a kind of path they can follow. Just to tie things up then, and I'm going to be a little bit provocative. So if we imagine that there may be a listener who we've converted to the idea of CTEM, it's not something they were focused on before, but now they think this maybe helps them conceptualize some of their challenges they're having, but also maybe some of the ways they were already thinking about their security practices and the way they wanted to go. So this is what they want to do now. How would we advise them to start? And I mean, super practically, is it go away and read a bunch of Gartner papers about CTEM? Is it sit down your board and say, this is my new approach? Is it sit down your security team? Ben, I'm going to quite unfairly just call on you to begin with. How would you say you would go about beginning with this?
I mean, the reality is that if they're working in a security team, they're probably already doing something of this. And so I think you can look at what you're currently doing through this lens, think about it once again through continuous and the various different elements of what can consist of your attack surface. So I guess if you start at the beginning of the process, you've got that scoping element. So you can run that scoping process to make sure that you are covering what you need to, and then just follow it through. I don't think this is a change in terms of the way, or a quantum leap in the terms of the way in which security is approached. I think it is a good way of structuring some of the stuff which a lot of people are already doing. So I would look at what you're currently doing and organize that into the process, and then look for gaps around that and run that scoping process. Because I think, like I said, there's probably elements of this which you're already doing, but it may highlight some areas where actually you need to put a bit more focus into that particular area. Maybe you need to invest in a bit more here. Maybe you need to up the way in which you're scanning it. Maybe you need to make sure that your scans are a bit more comprehensive and looking at more of an extended attack surface. Maybe you need to look at the way in which you prioritize and actually take action on some of these things. But as I said earlier, I think you're probably already doing something. So you look at organizing it, structuring it, and then seeing where your gaps are.
Brilliant. I guess, well, you were talking about the gaps as well, Michael. Was there anything else you'd add to that if someone's just kind of approaching this for the first time?
No, I think that's exactly the right way to think about doing this, right? Nobody's not doing anything for security right now, right? Everybody's got a bunch of these elements already in some form or fashion. And look at what you're doing and start at the pain points, right? Are you missing things? Are you always feeling like you're reacting rather than you're on top of it, right? So start there, right? Is it because you're constantly getting blindsided by issues on unmanaged assets or assets that you have no visibility on? Well, look at ways that you can improve that. Is it that your processes are too slow? And why is that? Is that because, the tools that you're using can't keep up with how dynamic this attack surface is? Look for ways to speed that up. Is it because you're just drowning in alerts from, threat intel platforms or other sort of ASMs or vulnerability platforms, and the output is not high signal enough, or how do you address that? Focus on that. And once you start picking these things off, that's when you start to elevate your maturity. One of the things that we've tried to avoid with the book is having a very prescriptive kind of step by step to the maturity levels, because again, you might be more mature in other areas. You might be comfortable with certain things, and there might be areas that are gaps. They will be obvious to you, right? And then you can start. This provides a bit of a framework with which to not only think about where those gaps are, but then how you might address those gaps and optimize your process. But I'd 100% agree with Ben. The best place to start is look at what you've got, look at where your pain points are, look at the high level of the practice and the ideal, and then just start to move various bits and pieces towards that. You start addressing a whole bunch of problems, and before you know it, you've solved a bunch of problems, right? So that's really the approach that I would echo as well.
Amazing. That's a very positive end. So that seems like a good note to draw a line under this episode of The Dark Dive. A big thank you to Ben and Michael for joining me. A reminder that if you'd like to find out more about this topic, you can download the ebook ASM in the Age of CTEM for free by following the link in the show notes, where you can also find our contact information if you have a question for us, a topic you'd like us to cover, or a suggestion for a guest. Please also remember that you can follow us for free on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, or whatever app you use to listen to podcasts to access our back catalogue, and make sure you don't miss new episodes as they're released monthly. Until next time, stay safe.